Hey guys, tonight I want you to imagine yourself waking up in another life. Not in your apartment, not in your cozy modern bed, but in a sprawling Victorian mansion so large that even the servants need a map to find their way around. You're not just anybody. You're part of the 1% of the 19th century, a millionaire in the age of coal, corsets, and candlelight. Now, being rich back then wasn't like being rich today. There were no private jets, no Ferraris, no high-rise penthouses. Your status was measured in silk top hats, in how many servants bowed when you walked into a room, and in whether your dinner jelly jiggled at just the right angle to impress the neighbors. It was a world of velvet curtains, gaslight chandeliers, and rules so complicated that you could ruin your reputation just by picking up the wrong fork. Let's be honest, though. We romanticize the Victorian elite, but their daily life wasn't all charm and candlelight. It was awkward, exhausting, and often absurd. Imagine needing an entire staff of people just to help you put on a pair of shoes. Imagine a bathroom that looked like a marble temple but worked like a ticking time bomb. Imagine owning more spoons than you could ever count, but never being entirely sure which one you were supposed to use for dessert. Your morning begins in a bed so enormous it could double as a squash court. The mattress is stuffed with horsehair, springs, and possibly enough feathers to wipe out an entire flock of geese. The sheets are crisp enough to give you paper cuts, and above you, painted cherubs staring down as if to say, "Really? Still in bed at 9? Pathetic." A housemaid tiptoes across acres of Turkish carpet, carrying a glass of water that is exactly 3/4 full, no more, no less. She apologizes for its temperature, apologizes for the lateness of the newspaper, and apologizes for the plumbing itself, which seems to have been designed by someone who hated both logic and water. Getting out of bed is its own production. Your dressing gown has been whisked away overnight to be pressed and perfumed with something called essence of empire, leaving you with a pair of ridiculous slippers that look like they were designed for sheep cosplay. Your valet hovers nearby, ready to guide you through the perilous ritual of getting dressed. And let's pause on that for a second, because Victorian clothing was less about comfort and more about sending the message, "I am rich enough to suffer." Gentlemen were trussed into starched collars that threatened to cut off circulation to the brain. Ladies endured corsets so tight they could bend spoons. Layers upon layers of fabric were draped, pinned, buttoned, and laced until movement itself became a luxury. Forget athleisure, the goal was to look like a marble statue, even if you were slowly suffocating under 20 pounds of lace. But every step of the ritual was symbolic. Putting on clothes wasn't just dressing, it was announcing yourself to society. Each glove, each sash, each absurdly large hat pin was a statement. You weren't just wealthy. You were disciplined, controlled, and above all, untouchable. At least until your corset broke a rib. Breakfast, of course, was not a casual affair. It wasn't just fuel for the day, it was theater. You entered a dining room the size of a modern airport terminal, lined with windows so tall they could double as watchtowers. The table stretched so far you could lose sight of the person at the other end, and heaven help you if you sat out of order. Toast was cold, jam was hoarded like contraband, and the family dog waited under the table, desperate for a fallen sausage. Every bite was consumed under the watchful eyes of servants, relatives, and the constant threat of social humiliation. And that was only the morning. Because the truth is, life as a Victorian millionaire was not about enjoying comfort. It was about performing comfort. You were on stage from the moment you opened your eyes. Your wealth wasn't just counted in coins. It was measured in appearances, the polished shoes, the perfect seating arrangements, the spotless silverware, and the carefully timed charity donation that made you look benevolent without ever actually getting your hands dirty. Of course, all of this pomp and ceremony came with hazards. Gas lamps that exploded without warning, boilers that turned bath time into a horror show, plumbing so experimental it deserved its own warning label. Fire was a constant fear, and moths were a sworn enemy. At any given moment, your mansion might be one misstep away from becoming a very expensive bonfire. And yet, for all the chaos, being a millionaire in Victorian England meant one thing above all else: status. The right invitations, the right friends, the right hat at the right party. Reputation was everything. Lose that, and you could fall faster than a bad souffle at a dinner party. So tonight, we're going to step inside that world. We're going to walk through the velvet corridors, peek into the drafty country manners, survive the endless dinner parties, and navigate the landmines of etiquette, fashion, and scandal. We'll see what it really meant to be rich in an age where having 100 forks was impressive, but knowing which one to use could make or break your future. Because being wealthy in the Victorian era wasn't just about silk waistcoats and golden teaspoons. It was about surviving the performance of wealth itself. One corset, one awkward dinner, and one jelly mold at a time. So, fluff your pillows, pour yourself a cup of tea, and get ready. You're about to spend a day as a Victorian millionaire. And trust me, it's going to be a very long day. Now that you've survived the battlefield of breakfast, it's time to face the next great challenge of Victorian wealth: personal hygiene. And let me warn you, if you thought modern plumbing can be annoying when the shower suddenly turns cold, imagine a bathroom where the pipes sound like a marching band warming up, and the bathtub looks less like a sanctuary and more like a marble coffin. Taking a bath in the late 1800 was never just about washing. It was about ceremony. Your bathroom, if you were rich enough to have one, looked like a temple dedicated to both comfort and chaos. Polished tiles that were cold enough to freeze your toes, a tub the size of a small rowboat, and a collection of oils, soaps, and powders so strongly scented they could knock out a horse. But the real star of this performance, the water. Getting hot water wasn't as simple as turning a handle. Behind the scenes, a miniature army of servants boiled kettles, lugged buckets, and coaxed the temperamental boiler into providing something that was neither scalding enough to boil lobsters nor icy enough to induce hypothermia. You wanted lukewarm comfort. What you usually got was roulette, and you were never alone. Forget the fantasy of a private soak with a glass of wine and a candle. Bathing was a team event. The valet hovered with towels, the maid guarded the soap, and somewhere in the background, a plumber listened nervously for the telltale hiss that meant the pipes were about to rebel. Privacy was a luxury nobody really had. Folding screens offered the illusion of modesty, but everyone knew the truth. Still, appearances mattered more than the actual result. A full bath might happen once a week, but each day you'd stage what could generously be called a mini performance of hygiene. A basin of tepid water, a sponge, and the hope that nobody asked how thorough you'd been. Powder, perfume, and cologne did the heavy lifting. If you smelled of lavender or rose water, society assumed you were spotless. Reality, however, was a little murkier. And then there were the teeth. Toothpaste wasn't the minty gel you squeeze from a neat little tube today. It was a gritty powder, a blend of chalk, charcoal, and wishful thinking. Toothbrushes were made from bone, with bristles so stiff you half expected to lose a tooth in the process. If you wanted fresh breath, you didn't reach for peppermint. You reached for vinegar, whiskey, or if you were desperate, a clove stuck between your molars. Romantic? Not exactly. Hair care wasn't much better. Ladies endured hours of curling, crimping, and pinning, while men drowned their locks in pomade and wax, creating styles that could probably survive a hurricane. If your hair looked shiny and immovable, congratulations, you were fashionable. If not, well, wigs and hairpieces were always an option. Entire closets held them, ready to transform you into whoever society expected you to be that night. Makeup, of course, had its own twisted rules. Paleness was prized. A face as white as porcelain suggested you hadn't worked a day in your life. Sun-kissed skin, that was for farmers. So women dusted their cheeks with powder until they looked like haunted pastries, dabbing a little rouge for color and lampblack for lashes. The effect was delicate, ghostly, and slightly alarming. Beauty meant appearing fragile, even if it meant poisoning yourself with lead powder in the process. But here's the thing. Cleanliness in the Victorian era wasn't really about being clean. It was about being seen as clean, smelling of roses while living in a coal-smoked city, wearing crisp linen while the streets ran with horse manure, looking polished even as the plumbing threatened to flood the house. And after all this fuss, after powders and perfumes, after corsets and collars, you still had to worry about the biggest threat of all, scandal. Because one stray bead of sweat at a ball, one faint whiff of something less than floral at a tea party, and you risked being whispered about for weeks. Cleanliness wasn't about health. It was about survival in a society where every gesture, every smell, every speck of dust told the world exactly who you were. So you powdered your face, cinched your corset, and pretended you were comfortable. You painted over exhaustion with rouge and hid panic under perfume. And then, finally, you were ready to step out into the glittering chaos of Victorian high society, where the true performance of wealth was only just beginning. Hey guys, now that you've endured the powder, perfumes, and the bone-bristled toothbrush, it's time for the next battlefield of the Victorian Millionaires' day, getting dressed. And make no mistake, this wasn't a casual routine. It was a full-blown production, a test of patience, endurance, and your ability to breathe while cinched into more layers than a wedding cake. Let's start with the undergarments. Picture it. Long linen drawers, a cotton undershirt, and maybe a chemise if you were a lady. Soft, comfortable, almost pajama-like. For one fleeting moment, life felt manageable. But then came the corset, the silent enemy of circulation. Whether you were a fashionable lady or a gentleman desperate to achieve that perfect upright silhouette, the corset was unavoidable. Laced tight by a valet or lady's maid, it pushed, pulled, and compressed until your waist looked enviably narrow and your lungs looked like they'd filed for divorce. Once you were adequately breathless, the starch entered the scene. Shirts were stiff as cardboard, collars so sharp they could probably cut glass. You didn't so much wear them as survive them. Men buttoned up waistcoats embroidered like miniature tapestries, while women endured layers of petticoats, bustles, and cage-like contraptions that turned every doorway into an architectural challenge. Imagine trying to sit down while dressed like an expanding umbrella. You'd think twice before accepting an invitation to tea. And the accessories. Gloves for morning, gloves for evening, gloves for walking in the park, gloves for waving from a carriage. If your gloves weren't spotless, people whispered. Shoes came with buttons so tiny you needed a special hook just to get them on. Pockets, forget it. Women carried reticules so small they could barely hold a coin, while men's coats had pockets that were purely decorative. Functionality was not the goal, suffering was. Now let's talk hats. Gentlemen balanced stovepipe top hats so tall they could knock against chandeliers. Ladies wore creations so enormous they doubled as bird sanctuaries, and sometimes actually included dead birds. Feathers, ribbons, veils, even entire nests. If your hat didn't threaten to poke someone's eye out at the opera, were you even fashionable? Every outfit carried a message. Clothing wasn't about comfort, it was about signaling wealth. Silk meant imports, velvet meant expense, lace meant servants with good eyesight. The rule was simple: the more inconvenient the outfit, the more respectable you appeared. Sweat and fainting spells weren't accidents, they were side effects of status. And just when you thought you'd finished, a valet or maid hovered to give the final inspection. Lint brushed away, bow straightened, sash adjusted, corset strings tugged one last time. You caught a glimpse of yourself in the mirror, elegant, polished, and just a little bit terrified. You looked like £1,000,000, mostly because half your fortune was sewn into the fabric. But here's the cruel truth. All that effort was just the warm-up. Because once you were dressed, the real ordeal began, stepping into the dining room for breakfast, where forks, knives, and conversation could destroy you faster than any corset ever could. So now you've survived the torture chamber that Victorians called getting dressed. You've been cinched, buttoned, brushed, and laced into an outfit that screams wealth but whispers quietly, "You can't breathe." And just when you think you deserve a moment of rest, you enter the dining room, a hall so large it could double as an airport lounge, and discover that breakfast isn't about eating. It's about performance. Picture the scene. Sunlight streams through windows taller than most children. A mahogany table stretches on and on, polished so brightly you can practically see your future mistakes reflected in it. Every chair is positioned with military precision, each place setting arranged as though a general personally oversaw the alignment of forks. If you sat in the wrong chair, you didn't just risk a scolding. You risked igniting a cold war within the family. At the head of the table sits the patriarch, buried in the times, wielding a newspaper like a sword. Every rustle of the page is a warning. The matriarch presides over the tea service with the gravity of a high priestess conducting an ancient ritual. Children, scrubbed to a shine and dressed like miniature diplomats, sit in descending order of importance, their eyes fixed on their plates as though they might reveal a prophecy. The food itself, oh, it was lavish. Eggs, kidneys, mountains of bacon, bread rolls, scones, and a parade of jams and marmalades. But don't be fooled, the toast was always cold, the butter always thin, and the peas sometimes arranged more like decorations than food. And then there was the infamous Victorian kidney dish, glistening ominously on a platter, daring you to remember which part of the animal you were eating. If you were sensible, you stuck to tea and bread, pretending to enjoy it while secretly dreaming of coffee and pancakes. But the real danger wasn't the food. It was the conversation, or rather the lack of it. The rules were endless, invisible, and terrifying. Children spoke only if spoken to. Adults only touched on safe topics: the weather, the roses in the conservatory, or the Queen's hat at the last parade. Heaven forbid someone mentioned politics, money, or bodily functions. A single slip, a careless joke about plumbing, or a compliment too enthusiastic could be interpreted as either vulgar or sarcastic. And then you'd spend the next month wondering why you weren't invited to Cousin Edith's luncheon. And always, there was the hovering presence of servants. Footmen stood like statues behind every chair, swooping in to remove crumbs, refill cups, or rescue you from an ill-fated attempt at spreading butter. Their silence was louder than any insult. A raised eyebrow from a butler could sting more than a duel. Imagine sitting there, corset crushing your ribs, trying to maneuver a fork sharper than your wit, while performing polite small talk under the gaze of half your extended family. Breakfast wasn't just the first meal of the day. It was the opening skirmish in a war of etiquette, status, and nerves. And when it finally ended, after the tea had been poured, the toast crunched, and the last murmured thank you, Mother whispered like a surrender, you weren't relaxed. You were exhausted. Breakfast was a victory if you left the table without scandal, a stain on your shirt, or a servant silently judging you for dropping jam on the carpet. Congratulations, you survived the first battle of the day. But don't celebrate yet, because the moment you rise from the table, the next campaign begins. Letters, visits, and an entire army of servants to manage. And trust me, in a Victorian mansion, managing people was a more delicate art than any duel. So now you've barely survived breakfast. Ribs aching under your corset, tongue dry from too much tea, and a stomach heavy with kidneys you didn't want in the first place. You step out of the dining room, thinking maybe the worst is behind you. But in truth, the hardest part of your day is just beginning. Because now, you must face the grand theater of Victorian household management, commanding dozens of servants without ever actually raising your voice or, God forbid, remembering all their names. Let's be clear, a Victorian mansion didn't run on charm. It ran on a staff of butlers, maids, cooks, footmen, gardeners, and stable boys, each one holding their own fragile place in the hierarchy. And if you misstepped, if you called the gardener cook, or worse, forgot to acknowledge the housekeeper's empire of keys, your life could spiral into quiet domestic warfare. At the very top of this human pyramid was the butler. Imagine a man with the presence of a general, the patience of a saint, and a mustache so stern it could intimidate a bishop. The butler didn't just pour your wine. He oversaw the entire household, made sure the silver sparkled, and kept the machinery of daily life humming so smoothly you barely noticed it. And trust me, if you ever did notice something going wrong, say, a missing fork or a late newspaper, the butler already knew about it, already fixed it, and already judged you silently for realizing. Beside him stood the housekeeper, a woman who could silence a room with a single jingle of her key ring. She controlled the female staff with military precision, scheduling their every move with the efficiency of a railway timetable. Cross her, and you might find your bed mysteriously underheated for the next month, or your favorite slippers misplaced in the coal scuttle. Then there was the cook, the fiery ruler of the kitchen. To you, meals appeared like magic, a parade of dishes that impressed your guests. But behind the scenes, the kitchen was a battlefield of boiling pots, frantic shouting, and the occasional flying ladle. If you dared request breakfast at 9:15 instead of 9 sharp, you might ignite a rebellion that would echo in your soup for weeks. And let's not forget the scullery maid, the lowest rung on this towering ladder. Her job was endless dishwashing, scrubbing until her hands turned raw. She lived in constant terror of the cook, wrote poetry about gravy in her spare time, and dreamed of a life where forks didn't outnumber friends. Footmen, meanwhile, glided about the house in livery so polished they looked more decorative than human. Their purpose: to carry things from one room to another, open doors with dramatic flair, and look silently disappointed if you asked them to do anything else. They moved in pairs, like synchronized penguins, and yes, they absolutely judged your choice of wine glass. All of these roles were woven together into one great illusion: that your mansion ran effortlessly like clockwork. But the truth, it was chaos barely contained. Servants slipped in and out like ghosts, listening, whispering, and remembering far too much. They knew your secrets, every drunken confession, every broken ornament, every midnight pie raid. And while you were the master or mistress in name, they were the true keepers of your reputation. So how did you manage this living, breathing ecosystem without losing your mind? Diplomacy. Endless diplomacy. You learned to smile vaguely, to say "my good man" or "you there," more often than actual names, and above all, to tip generously. A coin slipped into the right palm could make an inconvenient rumor vanish. Forget to tip, and suddenly everyone in town knew that your last dinner party ended with a pudding catastrophe. Running a Victorian mansion was less about control and more about performance. Another play, another mask. You had to look grateful without appearing weak, demanding without seeming cruel, and dignified even when you had no idea who half the people in your house were. And as exhausting as it all was, you couldn't escape it. Because the moment you left the breakfast table, the show began again. Every servant in that mansion was watching, listening, and silently recording your every move. Your wealth bought their labor, but it didn't buy their silence. So you moved carefully, always aware that while you held the title of master, they held the power of memory. And if they whispered the wrong story in the wrong ear, your precious reputation could unravel faster than a dropped corset lace. Congratulations, you survived another test, managing the silent army that made your life look effortless. But don't relax just yet, because the next arena of Victorian wealth wasn't about staff or food. It was about something far more visible, far more dangerous: fashion. Hey guys, let's be real, in Victorian England, your clothes weren't clothes. They were declarations. Silent billboards stitched in silk, velvet, and imported feathers that shouted your wealth before you ever opened your mouth. And if you think fashion today is demanding, imagine living in a world where putting on a jacket could take half a rugby team. For men, the rule was simple: if your suit could stand on its own without you in it, you were dressed properly. Stiff collars cut into your neck like you owed them money. Waistcoats were embroidered so heavily they could double as a family crest. Tailcoats and frock coats layered until you looked less like a man and more like a very determined piece of furniture. The pockets, useless. Carrying things yourself was beneath you. That's what footmen were for. Hats, of course, were mandatory. A gentleman's top hat wasn't just tall, it was practically a health hazard, threatening every chandelier within a 3-mile radius, and heaven help you if it got knocked off in a crowd. Your dignity could take years to recover, but gentlemen had it easy. For women, fashion was a battlefield, a high-stakes game of textile engineering. Think about it: 3 or 4 petticoats, a corset tight enough to test your lung capacity, a bustle big enough to seat a child on, and skirts so wide you had to strategize how to get through doorways. It wasn't just a dress, it was architecture. Every outfit said something. Silk whispered, "I can afford imports." Ostrich feathers shrieked, "Look at me." And lace, yards upon yards of it, fluttered as if it came preloaded with gossip. Comfort, a sin; utility, treason. If you could breathe too easily, you were underdressed. And then there were the hats. Oh, the hats. These weren't accessories, they were feats of engineering. Feathers, ribbons, even entire taxidermied birds perched on a nest of pins. One wrong sneeze, and your entire reputation could collapse along with your hat. Accessories sealed the deal. Men dangled watch fobs and tie pins just to prove they were too important to check the time like peasants. Women clinked under the weight of jewelry. Brooches like dinner plates, bracelets that jingled like a smithy at work, necklaces so heavy they bent posture into early scoliosis. Shoes, meanwhile, were delicate little tortures. For men, polished until they reflected your sins back at you. For women, dainty slippers tied with ribbons, completely unsuitable for, walking. Because why walk when you could faint gracefully into a chaise longue? Even the seasons had their rules. Summer demanded linen suits, white gloves, and the delicate act of pretending not to sweat through 6 layers of fabric. Winter was all fur muffs, capes, and mufflers that still didn't keep your ears from freezing on the way to the carriage. And God forbid you fell behind the trends. Fashion magazines arrived weekly, bursting with stern warnings, diagrams, and illustrations of scandalously dressed French women doing things that looked illegal in England. Your maid or valet was responsible not only for arranging your endless accessories, but also for remembering who you wore that blue cravat in front of last Thursday. Repeat it, and you risked being branded unfashionable. The point wasn't comfort. The point was status. You didn't dress to live. You dressed to be seen, judged, and hopefully envied. Every outfit was armor in the endless war of appearances. Too plain and you risked obscurity. Too daring and you risked exile. Just right and you were a living legend, or at least a decorative piece in the background of someone else's ball. So yes, you looked like £1 million mainly because you were wearing half of it. And if you collapsed from heat stroke in the garden, at least you collapsed fashionably. Congratulations. You survived Victorian fashion. But don't get too comfortable, because once you're dressed like royalty, society expects you to act like royalty. And that means one thing: evening entertainment. Now that you're swaddled in satin, velvet, and questionable hat choices, what do you do with your evening? No Netflix. No scrolling through your phone under the covers. No karaoke machine to embarrass yourself with. In Victorian England, your entertainment comes in the form of parlor games, live music, and an endless parade of forced conversation. And believe me, it's as exhausting as it sounds. Picture this. It's Wednesday night in 1878. The clock ticks like it's mocking you. The fire crackles, and guests in their most theatrical outfits shuffle into the parlor. The room is a battlefield of patterned carpets and stiff-backed chairs arranged to maximize polite suffering. On the walls, oil portraits of your grim ancestors watch every move like silent judges. The games begin. Charades is a favorite, though it usually collapses into chaos when Aunt Beatrice tries to mime Macbeth and ends up looking like a sheep with gout. Another favorite, the minister's cat. It sounds innocent, but soon devolves into a shouting match of adjectives and questionable spelling. The minister's cat is a scandalous cat. Cue forced laughter, as everyone remembers the real minister's cat caused quite the scandal last year. If your guests fancy themselves intellectuals, they play Consequences, a collaborative storytelling game that usually spirals into absurd tales starring Lord Pidlington, a turnip, and someone's scandalous cousin. The Victorians might not have memes, but they had chaos, and that was entertainment enough. Music, however, is the backbone of the night. There's always a cousin dragged to the piano, guilted into performing a nocturne or, worse, a sea shanty medley. Everyone claps politely, even if they'd rather stuff cotton in their ears. The unspoken rule: never ask for an encore unless you want the butler to sigh audibly for the rest of the night. And then there are the dramatic readings. Someone cracks open a volume of Tennyson, or even worse, their own novel. Imagine listening to your neighbor drone for hours about windswept moors while you try not to yawn into your teacup. You sip, you nod, you die a little inside. Conversation itself is another game with stricter rules than croquet. Safe topics: the weather, the Queen's latest hat, or whether the train to Bath is running on time. Forbidden: politics, plumbing, or personal feelings. Silence is patched with coughing, shuffling cards, or a sudden outburst of "Isn't this room drafty?" just to break the tension. And if you're lucky, maybe, just maybe, the highlight of the evening is the magician's visit, or the unveiling of a stereoscope showing blurry pictures of someone else's holiday in Brighton. That's as close to mind-blowing entertainment as it gets. Children, by the way, are banished to the nursery, left with marbles, tops, and the eternal dream of living in a century where cartoons exist. Meanwhile, the adults sit through yet another piano rendition of Chopsticks, sipping lukewarm tea and praying for bedtime. By the time the grandfather clock tolls midnight, everyone's patience has worn thinner than the aspic at dinner. Guests drift home, hosts collapse into chairs, and you, the Victorian millionaire, realize you've survived another night of enforced merriment. Tomorrow, of course, you'll do it all again, because in Victorian high society, the show never ends. If you thought breakfast with its cold toast and silent political maneuvering was exhausting, wait until you sit down for dinner. Because in the Victorian world, dining isn't just about eating. It's a full-scale endurance test, equal parts social theater, stomach training, and the constant fear of picking up the wrong fork. Picture a long mahogany table gleaming under a blaze of chandeliers, lined with candelabras tall enough to block your view of half the guests. Crystal glasses sparkle, silverware stretches outward like a miniature armory, and every inch of the table groans beneath fruit displays carved into shapes so elaborate you're afraid they might bite back. Dinner is less a meal than a marathon. The first course arrives, consommé so clear you're not sure there's anything in the bowl at all. You sip politely, already praying you'll make it through the night. Then comes the fish, followed by a roast of beef, followed by game bird stuffed inside another game bird, because excess is the point. By the fourth course, you start to wonder if this is dinner or some kind of Victorian hazing ritual. Vegetables, when they appear, are mostly decorative. Carrots sculpted into roses, peas glazed with enough butter to slide off your plate on their own, and mashed potatoes whipped so smooth they could double as plaster. And then there's aspic, that quivering, translucent nightmare of calves' feet jelly. You poke it, it wobbles ominously, and you hope no one notices you've pushed it discreetly to the side. Every course comes with wine, and in quantities that would make even the French blush. A footman hovers at your elbow, pouring vintages you've never heard of and describing them in tones of near-religious awe, even though he's never tasted a drop. By dessert, you're not sure whether you're tipsy, triumphant, or about to collapse in a gout-ridden heap. And dessert. Oh, dessert is pure Victorian madness. Towers of spun sugar, trifles so layered they look like geological specimens, cakes dense enough to double as foundation stones, and puddings that arrive with names like surprise, a word no sane diner wants to hear in connection with jelly. The The cheese tray alone is an adventure, its aroma strong enough to clear the room and yet somehow still considered refined. Meanwhile, the rules never stop. Pace yourself. Don't look too eager. Never, and I mean never, admit you don't know which fork to use. Every movement, from how you butter your bread to how you dab your brow with your monogrammed napkin, is judged. The hovering servants watch. The relatives watch. Even the dog under the table, waiting for scraps, seems to watch. At last, when you think the ordeal is over, the meal splits. Gentlemen retreat to the drawing room for cigars and port, the air thick with smoke and the kind of conversations no one writes down. Ladies drift into a separate room for coffee and the eternal ritual of comparing hats. And you sit back, dazed, stuffed, and quietly plotting a midnight raid on the leftover pie in your room, because somehow, despite 12 courses, you're still hungry. That's dinner as a Victorian millionaire, opulent, overwhelming, and never really about food. It's about power, appearances, and proving that your family's fortune is strong enough to survive another mountain of aspic. If you thought dinner was exhausting, just wait until we peek at the lives of Victorian children. Because in the millionaire household, kids aren't exactly little bundles of joy. They are more like miniature advertisements for family pride. When they appear in public, they're polished to perfection. Picture tiny sailor suits so crisp you could cut paper on the creases, or little white pinafores whiter than fresh snow, even though 3 maids had to scrub them for hours just to get them that way. Their hair is parted with military precision, shoes gleaming like mirrors, and every movement rehearsed like a stage play. At garden parties and Christmas gatherings, they line up like nervous chess pieces, bowing and curtsying while relatives murmur polite approval. But here's the secret. Most of the time, their parents barely see them. The real rulers of the nursery are the nanas, governesses, and tutors. These figures run childhood like a boot camp. Nanny can quiet a screaming child with nothing but a glare and a spoonful of tonic, which may or may not be laced with gin. Governesses drill the children in Latin, French, embroidery, and piano scales until little hands ache. Tutors drag the boys through lessons in Greek and geometry, while reminding them that Oxford awaits, whether they like it or not. Playtime, when it comes, is anything but carefree. Toys are elaborate porcelain dolls, tin soldiers, rocking horses, puzzles so complicated they look like training exercises for espionage. Outdoor games are mandatory, framed as both healthy and moral. Fresh air is considered a kind of medicine, so children are marched across the lawn like tiny regiments of well-dressed scarecrows. Affection is rationed. Hugs are rare. Bedtime stories are moral lessons in disguise, cautionary tales warning children what happens if they laugh too loud, talk too much, or, heaven forbid, embarrass the family name. And portraits. Oh, portraits are an ordeal. Imagine trying to keep 6 kids still for half an hour under heavy clothes, while the painter begs them to stop blinking. At least one child always has their eyes closed, immortalized in oil for generations to snicker at. The pressure is enormous. The eldest son carries the family's future on his small shoulders. Every tutor whispers of duty and inheritance. The daughters, meanwhile, are prepped for marriage markets, drilled in elegance, music, and the art of fainting gracefully during a waltz. Rivalries bloom in the nursery, as every child competes for approval, praise, and pudding privileges. To outsiders, Victorian children look like angels, ribbons, curls, and polite smiles. But behind the nursery doors, they are soldiers in training, each moment choreographed to prepare them for a world where family reputation outweighs happiness. And the strangest part, parents usually swoop in only for ceremonies, holidays, portraits, and public appearances, like occasional guest stars in their own children's lives. It's childhood Victorian style, strict, beautiful, and lonely. If children were treated like little trophies, then pets were even bigger ones. Because in a Victorian millionaire's home, animals weren't just companions. They were walking, barking, feather-fluttering status symbols. Start with the dogs. Not hunting hounds, but lap dogs so tiny they could practically fit inside a teacup. Imagine a pug in a velvet-lined basket, dressed in a satin jacket with a matching bow, fed on meals better than what most Londoners ever saw on their plates. These little creatures had wardrobes, raincoats, party outfits, even sailor suits for impromptu nautical strolls. If the dog's cravat clashed with the curtains, the butler might spend half an hour fixing the fashion faux pas. Parrots were another favorite, but not the kind that just squawk "Pretty Polly." No, Victorian millionaires wanted exotic birds that could recite Shakespeare, mimic a bishop's cough, or, if they were truly impressive, deliver insults in French. Guests would gasp in delight, half at the parrot's vocabulary and half at the fact that this family could afford to keep such a rare creature in a gilded cage lined with lace. And horses. Oh, the horses were practically aristocrats themselves. Groomed to perfection, draped in custom tack, and given names after obscure relatives or long-dead generals. A millionaire's stables were kingdoms of their own, managed by a head groom who often knew more secrets about the family than the butler did. These horses weren't just ridden. They were paraded, admired, and sometimes treated with more tenderness than the children upstairs. Then there were the truly eccentric choices. Monkeys in embroidered jackets, tortoises polished like ornaments, even peacocks strutting across manicured lawns, screaming like unhinged trumpets but looking magnificent while they did it. No Victorian garden was complete without at least one peacock, terrifying the servants and startling the postman into early retirement. And of course, pets meant parties. Imagine a Victorian pet show, where neighbors competed to see whose ferret wore the finest ribbon or whose cockatoo had the cleverest anecdote. Lord Cumberland might brag that his bird once had tea with Queen Victoria, while Lady Featherstone displayed a cat with its own jewel-encrusted collar. The animals weren't just pets. They were props in the endless game of one-upmanship. For the millionaire, pets were never about companionship alone. They were symbols of wealth, eccentricity, and excess. Each bark, squawk, or feathered display was another reminder that this family didn't just own fine things. They could afford to pamper life itself. So while London's streets echoed with hungry children and overworked horses pulling carts, inside the millionaire's home, a pug in a tiny bonnet dined on roast beef. So imagine this. You've got the house, the money, the staff, the lapdogs in sailor suits. But in Victorian England, none of that meant anything if society didn't recognize it. Wealth might buy you marble staircases and gold-plated chamber pots, but social standing, that was a battlefield, fought with calling cards, tea parties, and an etiquette code sharper than any duelist's sword. Here's how it worked. You never just showed up at someone's home. That was barbaric. Instead, you presented a calling card, a stiff piece of embossed paper, often edged with gold, announcing who you were, what title you held, and whether you had the decency to fold the corner to show you had delivered it in person. Think of it like Instagram but printed on ivory cardstock. Your reputation was measured not in likes, but in how many cards sat on the silver tray in your front hall. And heaven help the family whose tray was empty. That meant social extinction. The butler was the gatekeeper. When you arrived, he'd take your card on a polished tray, study it as though it were evidence in a trial, and then decide whether you'd be admitted to the parlor or sent packing with a polite excuse. And every tiny detail mattered: the thickness of the paper, the sharpness of your handwriting, the ink color. Too plain and you looked cheap. Too flamboyant and you looked desperate. Once you were admitted, the performance began. Conversations were polite duels fought with compliments and carefully hidden barbs. Tea was poured like a sacred ritual. One lump of sugar marked you as traditional, two as ambitious, three as dangerously eccentric. And yes, people whispered about it later. Sauces weren't for slurping. Cakes had their own tiny forks, unless you were in the kind of circle where forks were considered vulgar and replaced with decorative tongs. But the real test came with invitations. Balls, luncheons, country weekends, each one a stepping stone to higher status. Miss one, you might be forgotten. Accept the wrong one, you could be ruined. Everything was a trap. Wearing last season's color, arriving a few minutes late, or laughing at the wrong person's joke could send your name tumbling down the invisible ladder of social rank. And it was exhausting. Imagine having to remember who adored hats, who loathed cats, who was dangerous at whist, and who still hadn't forgiven you for sitting in the wrong chair 3 months ago. People literally kept annotated stacks of calling cards with notes scribbled on the back like, "Talks too much about gout," "Flirts with cousins," "Avoid near soup bowls." The stakes were enormous. To rise meant access to influence, marriages, and headlines that praised your family. To fall meant Cornwall, the metaphorical exile where social failures went to fade among relatives with questionable curtains and no hope of return. So yes, Victorian social climbing was less about enjoying tea and cake and more about surviving a blood sport played with forks, hats, and calling cards. And the millionaires at the top, they weren't just rich. They were champions of endurance, diplomacy, and the fine art of pretending to admire someone's bonnet 50 times an hour without collapsing in laughter. So if a London mansion whispered wealth, a country estate screamed it. For a Victorian millionaire, nothing announced you truly arrived quite like a drafty, echoing manor in the countryside. The bigger, older, and eerier, the better. City homes were for parties and business, but the country house was your crown, proof that your money was heavy enough to carry history itself. Picture the arrival. Carriage wheels crunch over gravel, footmen scatter like startled geese, and the housekeeper greets you at the door with a ledger full of problems, bats in the belfry, a roof that leaks in 12 places, and a ghost spotted near the library staircase again. Every hallway creaks with memory. Portraits of grim ancestors glare down from paneled walls, daring you to move a sofa without their permission. The air smells of lavender, polish, and something faintly sinister, like secrets buried beneath the flagstones. And the draft, always the draft. No matter how many tapestries you hang or fires you light, there's a chilly breeze lurking in every corridor, waiting to sneak down your neck the moment you forget your shawl. In winter, your breath fogs indoors as you wander endless halls, wrapped in 3 layers of wool and regret. In summer, the place blooms with damp, spiders, and mildew strains yet to be cataloged by science. Breakfast becomes an expedition. You leave your bedroom hunting for tea and eggs, only to get lost between the blue salon and the trophy room, where a stuffed fox and a hedgehog in a waistcoat stare back at you. The clock chimes from some distant wing, a time zone away, and you wonder if you'll ever see food again. Outside, acres of lawn stretch toward the horizon, dotted with peacocks shrieking like banshees and a maze so vast you once lost a cousin in it for most of Lent. The social calendar in the countryside was relentless. Picnics, archery contests, fox hunts, and endless dinners lit by candlelight. Neighbors came not just for the food, but to measure your worth against their own. Cucumber sandwiches sparked silent wars. Ghost stories were told after supper, sometimes followed by seances where guests tried to summon Great Aunt Mildred, usually to complain about the plumbing. And when the wind howled through the house at night, even the bravest butler wondered if his wages were high enough to face another week. Owning such a house wasn't leisure, it was endurance. You needed stamina to survive the drafts, courage to host tours for nosy city relatives, and the patience to listen to gardeners explain in excruciating detail why a single dandelion was an act of treason. Still, the country estate was everything. It said, "I am not just rich now, I am part of history," even if that history came with bats, mildew, and a labyrinth you could die in. So yes, congratulations, you've made it. The countryside is yours, and so are the ghosts, the drafts, and the endless dinners with neighbors who secretly hate your curtains. So here's the truth. Victorian millionaires didn't like to talk about how their money was made. In fact, they avoided it like an embarrassing rash. Everyone knew wealth had to come from somewhere, but the golden rule was simple: never discuss the details. Respectability was worth more than gold, and respectability demanded that your fortune appear timeless, noble, and utterly unsullied. If you were old money, you pretended your family had always been rich, as natural as oak trees in bad weather. You pointed to portraits of ancestors who looked distinguished, even if the painting had been commissioned last year and backdated a century. You spoke in Latin mottos, recited family legends, and insisted your great-grandfather was far too busy advising dukes to ever dirty his hands with trade. If you were new money, things got trickier. Maybe your fortune came from coal mines, shipping, or factories that belched smoke across half of England. Maybe your grandfather shipped tea, sugar, or something less polite like opium across the seas. Perhaps railroads and canals filled your coffers, or clever speculation on distant colonies you never planned to visit. But you never said that out loud. Instead, you murmured about sound investments or provident judgment, vague phrases that meant everything and nothing at once. And if someone dared press too hard, you smiled, changed the subject to the weather, or blamed the French. The less said, the better. Because while money built the mansions, money also carried shadows, failed investments, ruined workers, angry letters from Jamaica tucked in attic trunks, or whispers of unsafe factories where children worked 16-hour shifts so you could host a ball with 6 types of pudding. The fortune wasn't just about pounds in a bank. It was about property, titles, and heirlooms so ugly they had to be valuable. Silver tea sets no one used, ivory-handled walking sticks, and portraits of relatives who may or may not have been pirates. Inheritance often came with more headaches than glory: a decaying textile mill, a block of slum tenements, or a will so confusing even lawyers sighed before opening it. Managing wealth was a constant battle. The patriarch met with solicitors under lock and key, discussing which cousin was most likely to disgrace the family name, or how to discreetly cover up an uncle's disastrous investment in Peruvian bird droppings. Ledgers were guarded like state secrets. Ask to see the family accounts and you'd be met with horror, then a quick change of subject to trout fishing. And yet the fortune was fragile. A single scandal could topple it. A reckless duel, a runaway cousin, or the mysterious disappearance of the family diamonds during a particularly rowdy Christmas party. When disaster struck, families hushed it up, shipped the offending relative abroad, and carried on as though nothing had happened. Here's the irony: all that money rarely made anyone happy. It brought pressure, endless obligations, lawyers circling like vultures, and the constant dread that someone somewhere knew the truth about how the first pile of gold was made. But as every Victorian millionaire reminded themselves, better the burden of wealth than the misery of poverty. So you smiled, raised your glass to the family fortune, and prayed no one asked what was really in the attic. If breakfast was a battlefield and etiquette a minefield, then the Victorian ball was full-blown social warfare. Imagine a single night that could make your family's reputation soar, or collapse in front of 400 candlelit witnesses. That's what a ball was. It wasn't just about dancing. It was about being seen, judged, and remembered. Preparations began months in advance. Guest lists were debated like parliamentary bills. Every rival, eligible bachelor, and distant aristocrat had to be included, along with those just-in-case acquaintances who might suddenly inherit a title or a gin distillery. Invitations weren't emails or texts. They were cream-colored cards, handwritten, sealed with wax, and delivered by a sulking footman who had just walked 3 miles to the East Gatehouse. On the big day, the house erupted. Servants polished silver until their arms ached, dusted chandeliers, and even tried persuading the household ghosts to take the night off. The housekeeper barked orders like a general in petticoats, ensuring every marble bust was angled just so. Somewhere, a crisis always loomed, usually a centerpiece eaten by the family dog or a blocked lavatory threatening the entire event. By dusk, carriages lined the driveway. Ladies stepped down swathed in lace and velvet, while men tugged nervously at stiff collars that cut off circulation. Inside, the orchestra struck up a waltz so lively it could wake the dead, and the ballroom glittered with more candles than was strictly safe. Imagine a room filled with perfumes, feathers, jewels, and enough social ambition to fuel a small revolution. Dance cards became weapons of diplomacy. Mothers maneuvered their daughters toward desirable partners. Bachelors avoided eye contact with terrifying chaperones, and every step across the polished floor was a test. A stumble during the quadrille, that could haunt you for years. But by the third dance, the wine loosened inhibitions. Uncles were polking dangerously close to collapse, and at least one dowager had fainted gracefully onto a chaise longue. Meanwhile, the buffet groaned under its own ambition. Tiny sandwiches that wilted within minutes, molded jellies quivering like nervous debutantes, and ices so cold they could chip a tooth. The cheese table alone deserved its own map, while the punch bowl was watched by a vigilant footman making sure it stayed potent but not criminal. And of course, scandal was inevitable. A wardrobe malfunction here, a whispered argument there, a kiss stolen behind the ferns that everyone pretended not to see. Gossip flowed faster than champagne. Mrs. Forsyth, the county's unofficial news agency, collected every story for next week's tea. Reputations rose and fell before midnight struck. By the end of the night, shoes were abandoned, Corsets groaned, and guests staggered out into the dawn light, their dignity patched together with smelling salts and polite laughter. The servants faced their own battlefield, scraping wax off floors, gathering lost gloves, and coaxing snoring cousins out from under tables. Hosting a ball was exhausting, expensive, and dangerous. But without it, you risked fading into obscurity. For the Victorian millionaire, the ball wasn't just a party. It was survival, reputation, and social theater rolled into one. If hosting a ball was a test of stamina, then traveling as a Victorian millionaire was an outright endurance trial. You didn't just pack a bag and leave. You launched a full-scale operation that looked more like a military campaign than a holiday. It all started with the announcement, "We're going to Bath for the season," or "We must spend the summer in the country." That single sentence triggered chaos across the household. Valets and ladies' maids drew up lists longer than novels. Coachmen ordered repairs, and porters braced for a mountain of trunks that seemed to multiply in the hallway like rabbits. Every hat box, parasol, fan, and folded gown was deemed essential. A trip of 3 days required luggage enough for 3 months. If you traveled by carriage, the experience was bone-rattling. Even with the best springs, every pothole felt like divine punishment. Inside, passengers were swaddled in lap robes, surrounded by snacks, smelling salts, and enough tea supplies to host an emergency picnic. Conversation was polite at first, but by hour 5, the only real discussion was whether anyone would survive the ride without losing their sanity. Then came the train, a miracle of speed but not exactly comfort. Victorian train stations were organized chaos. Clouds of steam, hawking porters, and anxious aristocrats arguing over which class their lapdog should ride in. Tickets were clutched like lifelines, trunks were labeled and relabeled, and heaven help the footman who misplaced a lady's bonnet box. The train compartment promised luxury, velvet cushions, polished wood, and perhaps a view of the cabbage fields whizzing past. But the reality often included someone else's elbow lodged in your ribs, stale sandwiches from a trolley that seemed designed to test human digestion, and a bathroom so horrifying it made fainting seem like the safer option. Privacy didn't exist. Even whispers carried down the carriages, fueling gossip before you reached the next stop. And then, of course, the luggage. Mountains of it. Porters loaded, unloaded, and occasionally chased runaway trunks down platforms. A single misplaced trunk could turn into a social disaster. Imagine arriving at a country house party only to explain that your evening attire was on its way to Bristol along with the family tortoiseshell hairbrush. Mortifying. When you finally arrived, soot-stained and emotionally fragile, the host greeted you warmly, only to ask your opinion on wallpaper before you'd even caught your breath. You forced a smile, handed off your coat, and wondered silently if it was too soon to fake a headache and retreat upstairs. Travel in the Victorian age wasn't glamorous, it was survival. Yet it was also necessary. Because without the trips to London, Bath, or the family estate, how could you remind society you were still important? So, you endured the bumps, the boredom, and the terrifying bathrooms, all for the sake of reputation. If travel tested your patience, then medicine in Victorian times tested your very will to live. For the millionaire of the era, wealth bought you the best doctors, but that didn't necessarily mean the best outcomes. In fact, sometimes you wondered whether the treatment was worse than the illness itself. Imagine waking up with a headache. Today, you might take an aspirin. Back then, Your family doctor arrived in a frock coat, carrying a bag full of powders, tinctures, and a confidence that could only come from billing by the hour. His first question wasn't, "Where does it hurt?" but "Are your humors in balance?" That's right, Victorian medicine still clung to the ancient idea of humors, those mysterious bodily fluids blamed for everything from indigestion to heartbreak. The universal cure was laudanum, an intoxicating mix of opium and alcohol. It was handed out like candy. Stomachache, laudanum. Grief, laudanum. Teething baby keeping you awake. A few drops of laudanum, and suddenly the entire nursery was silent, sometimes a little too silent. For the wealthy, bottles of the stuff sat on silver trays, used casually like we'd use painkillers today, though with far more dramatic side effects. Then came mercury, a miracle metal in the eyes of Victorian science. Applied to the skin, swallowed in small doses, even rubbed on the gums. It was supposed to purge illness. What it really did was poison you slowly. But if your hair fell out or your vision blurred, the doctor assured you it was proof the treatment was working. And who could forget leeches? If you had a fever, they bled you. If your joints ached, they bled you. If you were simply bored on a Tuesday, someone probably suggested a few leeches just in case. Aristocrats swore by them, and apothecaries sold them in jars by the dozen. Each slimy little creature promised as a ticket back to health. Surgery, on the other hand, was something you prayed never to need. Anesthesia was in its infancy. Antiseptics barely existed, and surgical tools were often cleaned with the same rag used to polish the doctor's boots. If an operation was unavoidable, you were given brandy, a wooden stick to bite down on, and a few encouraging words before the surgeon got to work. Survival was rare enough that patients who lived through it were practically celebrities. And if none of that appealed, you could always try the Victorian buffet of quack remedies. Electric belts that promised to stimulate your organs, arsenic pills for a glowing complexion, mustard plasters smeared on your chest until you resembled a cooked ham, or perhaps the classic move to the seaside and drink seawater every morning. Yes, that was considered medicine. The strange part, some people survived all this, and those who did often claimed to be stronger for it, as if surviving Victorian medicine gave you immunity not just to illness but to common sense itself. For the millionaire, having a private doctor on call was a symbol of wealth. Whether or not you actually got better was almost beside the point. Hey guys, being rich in Victorian England didn't just mean buying mansions, hiring armies of servants, or hosting glittering balls. It also meant you had to look generous. Charity wasn't just kindness. It was a competitive sport, a form of social theater played out in soup kitchens, workhouses, and endless fundraising galas. Imagine stepping into a charity ball. The chandeliers sparkle, an orchestra plays something grand, and the walls are draped not just in flowers but in banners reminding everyone who paid for them. Your family crest in gilt letters, visible from every corner of the room. Guests sip wine while politely applauding speeches about the plight of orphans, all while eyeing your donation card to see how much you'll pledge this year. The real game wasn't helping the poor. It was outshining Lady Featherstone, who opened a library last month, or Sir Percival, who just funded scholarships for boys at Eton. Public acts of generosity were choreographed with military precision. A wealthy gentleman might step into a workhouse with photographers, or engravers in those days, ready to capture the moment he handed out bread. He didn't linger to hear the stories of hunger or hardship. He simply smiled, posed, and left, certain that tomorrow's society pages would praise his benevolence. And when Christmas came, baskets of coal, loaves of bread, and tiny gifts for children were distributed, but always with a reporter nearby, and a servant discreetly noting how many thank yous were received. Even soup kitchens became a kind of theater. Imagine well-dressed millionaires standing beside steaming cauldrons, ladling thin broth into bowls with all the solemnity of priests performing a ritual. The poor shuffled through, grateful but wary, as the donors hovered nearby, nodding gravely at the sight of rags and hollow cheeks. In reality, it wasn't just about filling stomachs. It was about filling reputations. Some charities were strategic. Endowing a hospital wing, sponsoring a school, or funding a park with your name carved into marble was the kind of philanthropy that polished your image for decades. It wasn't unusual for wealthy parents to donate just before their daughters came out in society, ensuring the family name was whispered in the right drawing rooms when marriage negotiations began. And then there were the performances disguised as generosity. Fundraisers where tickets cost more than most laborers earned in a week. Auctions where aristocrats bid outrageous sums just to prove they could. And charity concerts where the applause was as much for the donors as for the musicians. In the end, giving wasn't just about helping. It was about status. About proving you weren't just rich, you were morally rich. Yet behind the velvet curtains and gilded speeches, there was a lingering unease. Millionaires could buy virtue with gold, but they could never escape the sight of hunger in the streets. And so they gave, sometimes out of guilt, sometimes out of duty, but always with one eye on the audience. If money was the engine of Victorian high society, then scandal was the storm cloud that could stop it cold. To be a millionaire in that era wasn't just about surviving the markets, the fashions, or even the plumbing. It was about surviving gossip. One misplaced glance, one overheard conversation, or one too bold waltz at the wrong ball, and your entire reputation could unravel. Letters were especially dangerous. In a world without texting or discreet phone calls, every note you sent was like walking through a minefield. Forget to use the correct sealing wax. Whispers start. Write a phrase that could be misinterpreted. Half the county believes you've run off to Scotland. Servants read everything. Neighbors speculated endlessly, and the society columns thrived on the faintest hint of impropriety. Even a casual, sincerely yours could be twisted into the promise of a proposal. Then came the social engagements, the battlefield of reputation. Accepting the wrong dance partner at a ball could doom you for years. Sit too close to someone else's husband at dinner. The rumor mill wouldn't just turn, it would explode. And heaven forbid your name appeared in the newspaper alongside a scandal that wasn't even yours. Guilt by association was enough to see invitations dry up overnight. Your staff, meanwhile, held more power than you cared to admit. The butler knew every secret. The housekeeper could recall footprints in the garden after midnight. The scullery maid might sell stories for a single coin. Keeping them loyal required as much tact as keeping your stock portfolio intact. And if they weren't loyal, your private blunders became public entertainment before you even realized what had happened. Family members were just as risky. Cousins who gambled away fortunes, uncles with harebrained business schemes, sisters caught whispering with the wrong suitor. Each one had the potential to drag your name down with them. Family gatherings weren't about nostalgia. They were damage control. The unspoken motto of the upper classes might as well have been, "Let's never mention that unfortunate incident with the goat." And of course, scandals came in different sizes. A too short hemline, embarrassing but survivable. A duel gone wrong, an illegitimate child, or a gambling debt that swallowed an estate. Those could end dynasties. To navigate this world, you had to master the arts of denial, distraction, and when things got truly dire, disappearing to the countryside until everyone forgot. If rumors persisted, you blamed the French. If they grew louder, you claimed divine providence. Confession. That was reserved for memoirs written decades later, when all the guilty parties were safely in the grave. Reputation was everything. More precious than diamonds, more delicate than crystal, and more easily shattered than the nerves of a debutante at her first ball. And if you couldn't protect it, at least make the scandal big enough to be remembered with a wink. Better to be infamous than forgotten. Hey guys, let's be clear. If you were a millionaire in Victorian England, marriage wasn't a love story. It was a contract, a treaty between families, and the stakes were nothing less than the future of your fortune. From the moment you, or rather your mother, entered society, every glance across a ballroom became a calculation. Suitors were inspected like racehorses. How much land did they own? What titles came with their name? Could they bring a dowry big enough to cover the leaking roof in your second estate? The whispers of aunts, mothers, and eager matchmakers filled every drawing room, turning romance into a public stock exchange. For heirs, the pressure was suffocating. You weren't just choosing a partner, you were choosing the survival of your bloodline. A mistake could sink generations of careful scheming. That's why letters of courtship were inspected like official treaties, dances supervised like diplomatic summits, and every garden stroll shadowed by a chaperone whose eyes could pierce through brick walls. The wedding itself was less a celebration than a public performance. A guest list stretching from Parliament to third cousins twice removed. A cake so dense it required engineering calculations. Gifts that were impractical, hideous, or both. Massive silver candelabras, ridiculous vases, and the occasional taxidermy owl passed off as art. Everyone showed up not to witness love, but to take notes on alliances, inheritances, and how much champagne the bride's family could afford. And married life, well, that depended. Some couples grew fond of each other out of patience or sheer politeness. Others lived in separate wings, meeting occasionally at breakfast or during the annual family portrait. A charming spouse was a blessing, a terrifying one was endured, and an absent one. That left room for eccentric hobbies, relentless philanthropy, or far too many pets in tiny outfits. Children followed, each one a pawn in the endless game of strategy. Names chosen with care. Godparents selected for advantage. Education planned like a campaign. Oxford for the boys, French lessons, and music for the girls. Every child was less an individual and more an investment, a chance to secure the family's future through clever marriages of their own. And what about marrying for love? That was the ultimate rebellion, the kind that cost fortunes and burned bridges. It meant exile from drawing rooms, disapproving glares at every dinner, and whispered reminders that passion was for poets, not for people with estates to manage. Love was a luxury. Property was forever. In Victorian high society, marriage wasn't about finding your other half. It was about ensuring your heirs could inherit something worth having. And if affection happened to blossom along the way, that was a pleasant surprise, not the point of the contract. If you think leisure in Victorian England meant lounging in comfort, think again. For the wealthy, free time wasn't about rest. It was about performance. Even their hobbies were statements of class, carefully choreographed to show money, breeding, and just enough stamina to look impressive without breaking a sweat. The crown jewel of country leisure was the hunt. Imagine dawn breaking over misty fields as gentlemen in tweeds, polished boots, and heirloom rifles march out, surrounded by a parade of beaters, dogs, and nervous servants trailing behind. It wasn't just about shooting game. It was about displaying precision, tradition, and social dominance. At the end of the day, the stories mattered more than the bag of birds. No one really cared if Lord Smythe missed his shot, as long as he looked dignified while doing it. For the ladies, hunting meant following along just enough to be seen, but not enough to risk mud on their gowns. Instead, they perfected the art of the social stroll, offering polite encouragement while secretly praying for the moment everyone could go back indoors for sherry and gossip. On quieter afternoons, the lawns became battlefields of another kind, croquet. Don't let the gentle thud of wooden balls fool you. Croquet was vicious. A single, accidental tap sending a rival's ball spinning into the shrubbery could end friendships faster than a scandal in the society pages. Entire reputations were made or broken with the swing of a mallet, and every move was coated in sugary politeness and thinly veiled revenge. Of course, if the weather turned bad, and in England it always did, entertainment moved indoors. Billiards, card games, and chess became arenas of quiet combat, while the piano room offered endless recitals of Chopin, sometimes tolerable, sometimes terrifying. More daring souls tried fencing or archery, always under the eye of an instructor paid to flatter their clumsy efforts. Ladies filled the hours with embroidery, painting, or genteel watercolors of landscapes they'd never actually visited. Rowing on the Thames became another fashionable pastime. The catch: millionaires rarely rowed themselves. Instead, they reclined gracefully in the stern, parasols tilted just so while hired arms did the sweating. The goal wasn't exercise. It was to be seen looking elegant against the glitter of the water. And then came the spas. Bath, Cheltenham, Harrogate, resorts where the rich gathered to take the waters. Picture a gathering of silk-clad invalids lowering themselves into sulphurous pools, nodding gravely as doctors preached the miracles of mineral springs. The healing powers were dubious, but the social benefits were undeniable. If you were spotted in the right pavilion at the right hour, you were healthy enough for society, whether or not you could actually walk without a cane. At the end of the day, Victorian leisure wasn't about relaxation. It was theater, another stage on which the millionaire elite played their roles. Every game, every outing, every trip to the spa was carefully designed to signal wealth, resilience, and impeccable taste. Even doing nothing had to be done with elegance. If you think influencer culture is a modern invention, the Victorians would like a word. Long before Instagram filters and TikTok trends, the wealthy were masters at curating their image. A Victorian millionaire didn't just live in luxury. They staged it, painted it, and published it for everyone to see. Step into their drawing rooms and the walls speak before the hosts do. Portraits loomed above the fireplaces. Serious men with sideburns like storm clouds. Women draped in silks that cost more than a worker's yearly wage. And children posed with stiff smiles, clutching pets that likely bit the painter between sittings. These weren't just pictures. They were announcements. Look at us. We've arrived. We matter. The portrait sitting itself was a marathon. hours of holding a noble pose while the painter muttered about shadows and capturing your essence. The challenge was to look wealthy, important, and mysterious without tipping into arrogance or madness. Many chose to include symbolic props: a globe to suggest worldly knowledge, a violin to hint at refinement, or a loyal spaniel gazing up with soulful eyes, implying loyalty and virtue. Sometimes the symbolism worked. Sometimes it looked like a still life gone wrong. As photography gained ground, the game shifted. No longer confined to the slow grind of oil painting, a reputation could now spread through illustrated newspapers and cartes de visite, small photographic calling cards that people exchanged and collected like early trading cards. If your photograph circulated widely, you weren't just a person, you were a brand. But with this new visibility came risk. Every ball, every charity gala, every railway opening carried the chance of being captured in an unflattering light. A crooked smile, a poorly tied cravat, even the wrong expression of sympathy could trigger whispers in the drawing rooms. A flattering engraving could cement your image as a benefactor of society. A bad caricature in a satirical paper could haunt you for years. Reputation management became a full-time job. Families hired secretaries to spin stories, smooth scandals, and craft carefully worded letters to editors. A drunken stumble at Christmas might be reframed as a display of hearty holiday cheer. An argument in the conservatory became a passionate discussion of horticulture. And if all else failed, the family might suddenly develop an urgent desire to holiday in Switzerland, disappearing from society until gossip cooled. Legends were also part of the strategy. Every great family cultivated myths: a noble ancestor who fought at Waterloo, a grandmother who saved a village from famine, or a mysterious uncle who advised the queen. These tales grew taller with every retelling, blurring fact and fiction until they became family folklore, woven into dinner conversation like holy scripture. For the Victorian elite, reputation wasn't just important, it was survival. A fortune could be lost, rebuilt, or hidden. But a ruined reputation, that could exile you socially forever. One misstep, a misplaced joke, a failed investment whispered about in the wrong circles, or heaven forbid, a scandal involving a cousin and the wrong dance partner, and you could find yourself cut from society as swiftly as a bad headline vanishes from today's front page. So they fought back the only way they knew how, with polish, performance, and relentless self-promotion. They mastered the art of being fabulous before the word even existed. And in many ways, they laid the blueprint for the celebrity culture we still live in today. Imagine living in a mansion filled with the newest technology, but every single device is just as likely to kill you as it is to help you. That was the reality for the Victorian millionaire. For all their wealth, they lived in houses that were half palace, half science experiment. Let's start with gas lamps, the so-called miracle of modern light. Gone were the days of candles in every corner. Now your hallways glowed with glass globes fed by invisible pipes that twisted through the walls like metal veins. Lighting them wasn't simple. You needed a footman with nerves of steel and another servant holding a bucket of water, just in case. The glow was soft and golden, yes, but the lurking possibility of an explosion gave every dinner party a little extra suspense. Then came the bell pull, a network of ropes, wires, and tags that allowed you to summon servants from anywhere in the house. Each room had one, neatly labeled, and every tug sent a signal to the servants' hall where a wooden board rattled with falling tags. For the master, it was magic. For the staff, it was chaos. Imagine juggling 20 bells ringing at once, one calling for a shawl, another for tea, another because someone's slipper felt too tight. To you, it was convenience. To them, it was a never-ending game of hide and seek. And if you were truly fashionable, you might even have a telephone. Picture it. A heavy contraption sitting on a table like a strange brass insect. Most family members were too frightened to touch it, convinced it was either haunted or connected directly to the devil. When it rang during dinner, pandemonium followed. Guests stared, servants froze, and the butler announced the call as though delivering a royal decree. And the conversations themselves, half shouting, half static, and always the creeping fear that the neighbors were listening in. The kitchen was another battlefield of innovation. Iceboxes hummed with slabs of imported ice delivered by sweating men who looked like they'd fought wars with glaciers. Coal-fired ranges roared with so much heat they could melt iron, demanding a cook who doubled as an engineer. Even simple gadgets like the dumbwaiter, a little food elevator, were unpredictable. Some nights dinner rose to the dining room like magic. Other nights, it got stuck halfway, leaving the family with soup sloshing sadly in the shaft. Everywhere you turned, inventions promised luxury but delivered anxiety. Mechanical bread slicers chewed up loaves and occasionally fingertips. Speaking tubes let you shout orders across the house, but just as often carried gossip the wrong way. Plumbing rattled, clanged, and sometimes burst, filling the marble halls with steam clouds worthy of a train station. For the millionaire, this was progress. A house humming with the latest marvels, proof of wealth and modernity. But beneath the gleam was fear. The fear that the lights might explode, the boiler might burst, or the dumbwaiter might deliver a startled cat instead of supper. In the end, Victorian technology was less about saving time and more about showing off. It didn't matter if the telephone terrified the children, or if the icebox flooded the kitchen once a month. What mattered was being able to say, "We have one." Because in the world of the Victorian rich, innovation was not a tool. It was another performance, another way to prove that you were ahead of the curve, even if that curve sometimes ended in fire. Picture this. You're stepping out of your carriage wrapped in velvet, your boots polished until they shine like mirrors. The street outside smells faintly of fresh bread, but the children pressing their noses to the bakery window aren't eating it. They're staring wide-eyed while you sweep past, deciding whether to take afternoon tea or a light supper. That was life for the Victorian millionaire. The contrast between their world and everyone else's was so sharp it could cut glass. Everywhere you went, the poor were the backdrop, sweeping the streets, scrubbing doorsteps, hauling coal through the rain. They were visible but invisible, seen only as part of the scenery while wealth paraded by. You knew your fortune rested on them. The miners, the factory hands, the endless stream of laborers who made your linen, polished your silver, and built the very trains that carried you to the countryside. But polite society demanded you acknowledge their suffering only in carefully staged doses. That's where charity came in. To the Victorian elite, charity wasn't just kindness, it was theater. You didn't give quietly, you gave with a flourish. Coins pressed into little hands while a journalist scribbled nearby. Loaves of bread handed out on Christmas morning while an engraving artist captured your benevolent expression. It wasn't about feeding the hungry so much as feeding the newspapers. ensuring your name appeared beside words like generous and noble. Philanthropy became competitive. Lady Featherstone might endow a library, so you funded two, plus a bronze statue in the park. Sir Percival might donate scholarships, so you countered with a children's hospital wing bearing your family crest over the door. It was a high-stakes game of one-upmanship, each gift carefully calculated to polish reputations and outshine rivals. Of course, some of it was practical. Hosting a charity gala, for instance, let you combine duty with pleasure. You danced beneath chandeliers, drank champagne, and wrote checks, all while making sure your rivals noticed just how much you'd given. The annual soup kitchen visit was another ritual. You'd arrive in a carriage, hand out ladles of watery broth, and retreat before catching a whiff of hardship too strong. It wasn't just help, it was a performance of virtue. But guilt had a way of sneaking in. Maybe it was the cough of a ragged child in the street, or the haunted eyes of a laborer you passed too quickly. Maybe it was your own child asking the question no one wanted to answer. Mama, why are they hungry? In those moments, you felt the chasm between your silk-curtained world and theirs. And sometimes the only cure was writing a larger check, baking a few more loaves, or redoubling your public generosity, anything to restore peace of mind. The truth was, charity in Victorian England was rarely about change. It reinforced the order of things, the rich as benevolent givers, the poor as grateful recipients. It was as much about optics as outcomes. Did it ease suffering? Yes, a little. Did it soothe consciences? Absolutely. But did it close the gap between velvet and rags? Not even close. So the millionaire went on, handing out symbolic cakes, sponsoring Christmas coal, smiling for the engravings, always balancing compassion with calculation. Because in a world where appearances were everything, even generosity had to be polished, perfumed, and performed. When we think of wealth, we picture marble bathrooms, hot showers on demand, and closets lined with soft towels. But in Victorian England, even the richest millionaires were living in a world where running water was a novelty, deodorant hadn't been invented, and cleanliness was often more performance than reality. Bathing itself was an event. You didn't casually hop into the tub. A full bath was such a production it might be announced like an opera premiere. The staff had to heat buckets of water, haul them upstairs, arrange the towels, light candles, and make sure the fire brigade was on call in case the boiler went rogue. You'd slide into marble and porcelain surrounded not by steam and solitude, but by hovering attendants armed with bath oils and the faint look of people who had other things they'd rather be doing. And if a full bath felt like too much effort, which it often did, there was always the sponge bath. Picture it, a basin of tepid water, a flannel cloth, and you standing behind a folding screen while your valet or ladies made muttered commentary about your hair, your nails, or your general lack of discipline. Some families even insisted on two basins, one for upper and one for lower parts, because nothing said Victorian decency like micromanaging hygiene. Soap, at least, was plentiful, though it was less about lather and more about perfume. Heavily scented bars of lavender or rose, sometimes carved with your initials, filled the air with fragrance strong enough to mask coal smoke, horse manure, and the omnipresent dampness of English weather. Shampoo as we know it didn't exist. Instead, you sprinkled powder in your hair, brushed it vigorously, or relied on pomade so thick it could double as glue. Men favored bare grease or wax, molding their hair into glossy helmets, while women curled, crimped, and slept with hair wrapped in rags just to emerge with the perfect bounce. And what about deodorant? Forget it. If you were worried about odor, your only defense was perfume, cologne, or a sachet of herbs tucked discreetly into your bodice or coat pocket. On hot days, everyone just prayed for rain and pretended not to notice. Dental care wasn't much better. Toothpaste usually came as a gritty powder of chalk or charcoal, rubbed in with a brush made of bone and pig bristles. Fresh breath was a dream, at best. You'd gargle vinegar or take a swig of gin. If you wanted minty freshness, well, you'd have to wait for the 20th century. And then came cosmetics. Pale skin was prized, so ladies dusted their faces until they looked like haunted pastries. Rouge was dabbed on cheeks for color, lamp black brushed onto lashes, and powder puffed until portraits made you look half human, half statue. Wigs and hairpieces were common, not just for elegance but for hiding thinning hair or the occasional lice problem. But here's the funny part. No matter how much effort went into powders, perfumes, and rituals, disaster was always one step away. A sudden rainstorm could smear rouge down your cheek. A stray dog could ruin your carefully powdered gown. And God forbid a bishop dropped by unannounced. Your entire performance of hygiene might collapse in an instant. So in the end, being clean as a Victorian millionaire wasn't about actually being scrubbed spotless. It was about looking the part, smelling floral enough to pass in polite company, and praying no one got close enough to notice the cracks. Appearance was everything. Reality, well, reality could wait until the next sponge bath. If the Victorian day was a theater of etiquette, the night was a Gothic play, full of shadows, creaks, and quiet dread. Once the last guest left and the staff began their nightly rituals, your mansion, huge, drafty, and never truly silent, came alive in ways you didn't entirely want. The rounds always came first. The butler and a footman would move through every hallway checking locks, securing windows, and rattling chains with the solemnity of prison wardens. Victorian houses weren't built for peace of mind. Glass panes rattled, doors groaned, and even with 20 locks, you never quite felt safe. Burglars were a constant fear. Ghosts were worse, and the housekeeper swore both visited nightly. Once the bolts were drawn, the family would retreat to the drawing room where firelight threw dancing shadows on wallpaper patterned with vines or hunting scenes. This was the hour for ghost stories. Tales of phantom coaches thundering across moors, banshees wailing in distant wind, or portraits whose painted eyes followed you down hallways. Children listened wide-eyed. Adults pretended they didn't believe, and every so often someone swore they heard footsteps in the attic. Was it a spirit? Or just the second footman raiding the pantry again? The climb to bed was its own production. Imagine candlelit figures drifting through endless corridors, every cousin balancing a candlestick, a Dickens novel, and the fear of bumping into a ghost, or worse, the cat, who always picked the darkest patch of carpet to stretch out on. Drafts made tapestries shiver, floors creaked like warnings, and every corner felt like an ambush. Finally, your bedroom, a cavernous sanctuary of velvet curtains and a bed piled with enough quilts to survive Siberia. Before you slept, one last parade of servants passed through. A maid stoked the fire, the under-butler checked the locks again, and sometimes the cook appeared with a plate of cold pie, proof that in Victorian life, midnight snacks were as serious as security. And then the lights went out. Candles snuffed one by one. The house sank into silence, and you lay awake listening. To the faint tick of clocks, to the wind rattling windows, to the creak of staircases that might have been wood or might have been something else. Even sleep was uneasy. Dreams twisted with worries. The wrong fork at dinner, an overheard whisper, or the suspicion that an American cousin might turn up uninvited. But if you did drift off, you were wrapped in layers of blankets, lavender-scented air, and the comforting chime of the grandfather clock in the hall. Victorian wealth might have bought luxury, but it never bought peace of mind. At night, the house belonged to shadows. Hey guys, imagine living in a world where every thought, every invitation, and every social maneuver had to be written down with a quill pen on paper thick enough to double as armor. That was communication for a Victorian millionaire. Forget texting. Forget calling. Every message was a performance, rehearsed, polished, and designed to impress, or at the very least, not destroy your reputation. The day often began at your writing desk, freshly arranged by your maid. A silver inkwell gleamed beside blotting paper. A row of sharpened quills waited like soldiers on parade, and a neat stack of heavy, cream-colored paper sat embossed with your initials. Anything less elegant would signal ruin. Cheap paper meant cheap character. Imagine starting your morning already haunted by the thought that your stationery might betray you. Handwriting mattered too. Loops and flourishes weren't just for decoration. They told the world whether you were refined or reckless. A crooked line could suggest carelessness. An ink blot could ruin a friendship. And heaven forbid your letter lacked just the right balance of humility and hidden meaning. My dearest Lady Featherstone meant one thing. Esteemed Sir meant another. Sir alone was practically a declaration of war. Then came the content itself, a delicate dance of wit, coded hints, and carefully veiled insults. You could never be too direct. An invitation to tea was really a test of loyalty. A compliment might hide a challenge, and a simple warmest regards could be read as either genuine affection or a velvet-gloved slap across the face. Every word carried weight, and every sentence was a trap. Once finished, the letter had to be sealed, usually with wax bearing your family crest. Too much wax meant arrogance. Too little meant weakness. The color mattered too. Black for mourning, red for boldness, and plain brown if you were prepared for polite irrelevance. And then, of course, the post. Your butler didn't just deliver it. He presented it like it was a royal decree. At the local post office, every envelope was weighed, stamped, and inspected as if it might contain state secrets. Then began the waiting game. Replies arrived days later, creased, smudged, and smelling faintly of the stranger who carried them. Opening them was like opening Pandora's box. Were you being invited to a ball, insulted in the most elegant terms possible, or, worse, ignored entirely? One poorly chosen, sincerely yours could collapse an alliance. One ever your devoted could spark a duel. And because misunderstandings spread faster than telegrams, half the county might soon believe you were on your deathbed, engaged to the wrong cousin, or hiding in the countryside in disgrace. Letters were both lifeline and landmine. The more you wrote, the more you risked. And yet, for all the drama, Victorians loved their letters. They framed them, saved them, tied them with ribbon, and read them aloud by candlelight like they were sacred texts. Letters weren't just communication. They were social media, reputation, and theater all at once. The stakes were high, the ink was permanent, and one flourish of a quill could make or break your standing. So yes, Victorian millionaires wrote endlessly, carefully, and with the constant awareness that every word might echo for decades. After all, history wasn't just written by the victors. It was written by whoever had the sharpest quill and the best paper. Here's a little truth no one puts in the history books. Being rich in Victorian England didn't mean you lived in comfort. It meant you lived in a house that looked like a palace but secretly wanted you dead. Beneath the chandeliers, velvet curtains, and polished staircases, your home was a ticking time bomb of fire, water, and bad engineering. The greatest enemy: fire. Candles flickered in every hallway, coal fires smoldered in every room, and gas lamps hissed ominously along the walls. A single gust of wind, a careless cigar, or even an enthusiastic cat could set half your drapes ablaze before you finished dessert. That's why every servant in the house was trained for fire protocol, which basically meant forming a panicked bucket brigade and hoping the kitchen had more water than custard at the moment. Water, ironically, was just as dangerous. Roofs leaked, cellars flooded, and the new plumbing was less a marvel and more a menace. Pipes groaned like they were haunted, boilers hissed like steam dragons, and every so often one would erupt in a cloud of scalding mist that had half the household screaming and the other half rewriting their wills. A single rainstorm could send water cascading into your conservatory, drowning your orchids and leaving you to explain to your guests why the parlor now resembled a swamp. And then came the pests. Mice gnawed at your walls. Moths treated your silk drapes like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Bedbugs thrived in even the finest feather mattresses. And the family cat. It was supposed to handle all of this, but it usually just napped in the linen closet while chaos reigned. Every season brought new infestations. Cockroaches in the pantry, worms in the flour, a snake in the cellar if you were truly unlucky. Technology didn't help. Early labor-saving devices often created more disasters than they solved. Mechanical bread slicers jammed. Water closets flushed so loudly they scared the servants half to death. And dumbwaiters, the little elevators for food, sometimes got stuck halfway between floors, leaving your roast beef dangling in midair like a tragic art installation. At least twice a month, something broke, flooded, or burst into flames. The servants banded together, improvising repairs with buckets, mops, or sheer denial. The butler would call it character building. The cook would threaten to quit unless the ceiling stopped dripping on the pudding. And you, the master of the house, would smile through it all, reminding yourself that appearances mattered more than reality. Because that was the cruel irony of Victorian wealth. Your mansion might shine with crystal and marble, but beneath it all, it was held together by spit, polish, and a prayer. Every night you blew out the candles wondering if you'd wake up to fire, flood, or a chorus of rats rehearsing in the walls. Imagine being so rich that your fortune could fund half of London, yet still losing sleep over the angle of your bow or whether you touched the wrong fork at dinner. That's what it was like for the Victorian elite. Money gave you status, sure, but etiquette was the battlefield where reputations were won and lost. From the moment you could walk, manners were drilled into you like military training. Children of millionaires learned to curtsy before they could spell their own names. By age 5, you knew exactly when to say "how do you do," and when to say "your grace," and God help you if you confused a marquess with a viscount. That single mistake could haunt your family's name for decades. Dining was the ultimate test. A Victorian dinner table looked less like a meal and more like a weapons cache of silverware, each fork waiting to expose you as an imposter. The rule was simple: start from the outside and work your way in. But the fear of grabbing the wrong knife could make even the most confident millionaire sweat bullets. Soup had to be sipped silently from the side of the spoon. Asparagus could be eaten with your fingers only at lunch, and if you dropped something, you didn't pick it up. You fainted, and servants discreetly removed you while the conversation continued without a ripple. And conversation, oh, that was an Olympic event in itself. Small talk wasn't about being interesting. It was about being harmless. You spoke of the weather, of roses in the conservatory, of the Queen's latest portrait. You never mentioned politics, money, or, heaven forbid, bodily functions. You laughed only if a duchess laughed first, and every sentence had to balance between wit and restraint, like walking a tightrope in full evening dress. Even posture was a minefield. Girls balanced books on their heads to perfect their curtsy. Boys practiced bows so precise they measured exactly 15 degrees, no more, no less. An ankle shown too boldly could spark gossip across 3 counties. A handshake too firm might brand you a brute. Every gesture was studied, recorded, and whispered about later in drawing rooms lit by gaslight. For the truly unlucky, there was etiquette school, run by governesses so strict they made generals look soft. These women hovered over children at dinner tables, corrected every blink and swallow, and punished even the faintest giggle. By the end, you weren't just well-mannered. You were permanently traumatized, forever haunted by the sound of a governess clearing her throat whenever you reached for the wrong glass. Victorian etiquette was less about grace and more about survival. To live in that world was to live under constant surveillance. A raised eyebrow could cut deeper than a sword. A whispered "did you see how she handled her fish knife?" could end a reputation faster than bankruptcy. So while the poor struggled with hunger and disease, the rich were fighting their own war, a daily battle against forks, curtsies, and the crushing fear of social disgrace. Hey guys, we've finally reached the end of our long walk through the velvet-curtained halls and candlelit corridors of Victorian wealth. We've seen the absurd splendor, the endless rules of etiquette, and the quiet loneliness hidden behind gilded doors. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Money can buy silk slippers, silver teapots, and even mansions that echo with ghosts, but it never buys peace of mind. As you lay down tonight, remember how lucky we are to live in a world with hot showers, soft pajamas, and homes that don't require 20 servants just to survive a bath. We can laugh at the strangeness of the past, learn from it, and then let it drift away like smoke from a gas lamp. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and rest easy. No scandals to dodge, no corsets to tighten, no butlers hovering in the shadows, just the simple comfort of your own bed. Good night, my friends. Sleep well, dream warmly. And may your night be as peaceful as a candle burning low in a safe, quiet room.